There you go. Thank you, Chris.
Well, thank you, Doug, and thank you to the Global Chamber and to my colleague Jacqui. We're here to amplify blockchain, crypto, and digital currencies under the brand name of JNC, Jacqui and Chris, on BCD. And the goal here is really to do a little bit of a throwback, go back and look at the foundational elements of the blockchain technology, and then to trace that through its current progress with use cases. Who's using it today? And who is positioned to use it to create value in time, efficiency, security, and other types of applications. So we'll be exploring this on a monthly basis, and this is the inaugural version. So first, let me say welcome to everyone, and welcome to Jacqui.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. There's a lot within our community that's evolving and changing. And so knowing the history is always important, and also knowing current events. So that way you can kind of stay current.
So the goal here is to be extremely interactive as we progress. We love to have the audience put questions in the chat, comments, and then we'll have some time at the end to do question and direct response. So with that said, let me ask Jacqui to briefly introduce her long background in crypto in a format suitable for this audience.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Chris. So I actually ended up stepping into the blockchain space a little bit over 10 years ago. And my background is law as well as education. And I'm a practicing attorney partner at Cogent Law Group. But I've also, I'm an entrepreneur in many ways within the blockchain space. So I've created resources for individuals who are stepping into the space, because I realized that I didn't have resources when I started. And it's become a lot easier now to gain information, but also in many ways a lot more complicated, because even though artificial intelligence definitely was around when I started, it's definitely taken predominance. So now the question is not where do you get information, but how do you validate that the information that you are seeing is true? And then, where else do you go for additional resources? So that's the purpose of many of the businesses that we'll be talking about today. And, again, it's an ever evolving space. So it also means that the vocabulary is changing, and there could be multiple meanings within one word. So it really is important that assumptions aren't made, and that you dive deep and to make sure your understanding is correct, because especially if you're doing any investments. Now, I will say that this is not investment advice, legal advice, or anything else like that, but it's educational all the way around. So Chris, I'm going to throw it back to you.
Thank you for that, Jacqui. And I'll echo that this isn't legal advice because I'm a practicing attorney, but most of my career has been technology applications related to innovation, law, regulatory, both startups, as well as enterprise types organizations like governments with billions of dollars and private sector. My focus is on how to make technology more accessible, available, and affordable, especially to historically underrepresented communities. So not only do I practice law from an intellectual property perspective, but I also am fortunate to have a social impact IP legal tech startup. And one of the key technology features it uses is blockchain. So we've aggressively looked at where can we help this technology be adopted broadly where it makes sense. And one of the cool parts, to amplify something Jacqui said, is it's happening. And we're going to share with you some of these significant use cases and potential cases. On the screen, you see a quick overview of our agenda. We've done the introductions. We'll talk about the technology underpinnings and what Mr. Satoshi Nakamoto, we assume it's Mr., meant when they started this whole idea. Then we'll get into the use cases, have some interactive questions and answers for you to consider, and then we'll close it up until the next show. Now let's start off then. As we're going through this, give some thought to what is this blockchain from your perspective. So we're going to share with you some of the academic and factual basis in technology. Have you heard of it? If you have, what's the definition? Have you had any experience with it? Keep those things in mind. And if you're not here to put on the chat today, drop us an email. So building on that, let's talk about what is the technology? And we're doing it in two parts. I mentioned Satoshi Nakamoto's idea of having a technology that was a disintermediary. Means let's take the banks out of the middle of this and have a peer-to-peer economic platform that also had some features like anonymity. That was part of the conceptual idea. And then you can see that that was the foundation piece of blockchain, along with cryptographics and others. And the idea was to be able to let the code be the law, so to speak, from a technology perspective, and enable economic transactions through smart contracts, and be a foundation for some of these exciting digital currencies and other things. That's my quick take. Jacqui, what's your perspective on that?
Well, so I want to just point out historically, even way before the Bitcoin white paper with Satoshi, blockchain existed. So it's existed over 34 years. Some of the major companies within our space, IBM and others, they just didn't, they knew about it, they just weren't quite sure how to integrate it. And two of the leaders in our space that are actually still doing development in various ways, which we'll talk about, is Dr. Scott Stornetta and Dr. Stuart Haber. They actually pioneered the role of the blockchain, and they also created a working blockchain even prior to the creation of Bitcoin. And in the Bitcoin white paper, they are mentioned 4 times. So within the Maryland Blockchain Association, which is one of the entities that I've started, on the front page, you'll find a quote from Dr. Scott Stornetta, and I've had the privilege and honor of meeting with him and having him be part of the Maryland Blockchain Association, as well as working with him on some of the tech stack that he's doing within the artificial intelligence side, because he's concerned about deepfakes, and he's created another tool that will support protecting your identity. But going back to the blockchain side, it has existed, for many years. And the reason why they wanted to ask the question of how can you kind of digitally timestamp documents to know that they were at that moment in time, quote unquote, true, was, now remember, you can timestamp a document to say that it existed at that time, but it doesn't mean the quality of the document, that what is on there is true or fake. So you have 2 other things there. But they did create this timestamping, so that way, in that moment of time, you could make sure that the information was transmitted, and it could be shared with individuals who needed to have that. So, and that, if you take that a step farther, in many ways, that one of the business applications that we're going to be talking about is supply chain. So it allowed for having information from point A that needs to go to point Z, and people who ended up having that information shared with them at point Z knew that the information was the same that left at point A. So the blockchain provided a very secure way, immutable way for the information to be shared in a way that someone couldn't tamper with it once it was on the blockchain. And that was important for the fidelity of the information. Again, you have the procedural framework of what blockchain is. That's different than the quality of the information that happens to be in the blockchain. So there's 2 different points here, because you could put, unfortunately, fake history into the blockchain, and that would simply be time-stamped. It's, so there's the qualitative side and the quantitative side.
Well, thank you for that, Jacqui. And that starts to amplify a number of the things that are getting our interest. And this image just represents kind of a tripartite segmentation of blockchain technology. On the left side, literally, it is intended to represent the blocks of data, the hashes and other things, and represent the distributed nature, which you in essence have crowdsourcing validation for accuracy. The middle gets into the part that seems to get most folks' attention. It's like Bitcoin. And, it's astronomically valued today. And certain policymakers and others are building on that to create new forms of money, which is represented by the far right side, digital currencies, like stable coins and others. So there's a more fundamental aspect of that. If you look at it just from a tech stack, for those who like to think about a technology perspective, the blockchain might be considered to be certain elements. We mentioned the cryptographic hashing is mathematics to enable code as law. We mentioned that it's distributed. So if you wanted to try to fake something, you'd have to try really hard because you have to fake it for everyone that's recipient on the blockchain. There's asymmetric cryptography, there are algorithms involved, and then there's a peer-to-peer nature of it. That's a foundational piece, but we're starting to see different variations from different providers like Ethereum, Solana, and other types of platforms. The key piece is they're creating the potential for trust and efficiency that is unique. Before I move forward, let me just stop. Because Jacqui, any thoughts on that you want to share?
So, again, there's a lot of, you talk about Bitcoin, and so I want to kind of point out for those that are listening or watching, there's what's also called altcoins. And so I want to just kind of make a distinction. Bitcoin, is the original, and it really truly is decentralized. When Ethereum was created, it was an individual. We don't really know who Satoshi is, but with Ethereum we do. So it was a group of individuals that created that. And then, there were so many other altcoins that kind of spun off as a result of that, because they were trying to solve a problem that Bitcoin at that point, when it was first created, wasn't able to do. You weren't able to build on top of it like with businesses, or now you have Lightning and you have what is called a layer 2. So those altcoins, you do have to understand that those are projects or businesses that individuals create that might not be decentralized, that might be owned by a company. And so again, the underlying blockchain technology is a tool, but the token that's built on top of it for these altcoins, you really do need to think of it like a traditional business, even though it is an alternative technology, even though not so alternative anymore. So how you invest in these altcoins, you really need to approach it with the same, not caution, but view that there can be risk. And you need to look at it like, if you were to go to a company and buy stock, would you just put in $10 for stock? Or would you look at who's the board of directors, or how long did that company exist, or what's its history? So again, we sometimes are approaching cryptocurrency, other than Bitcoin, in a different manner. And I think that our whole mindset needs to kind of take a little bit of a turn, because it is, the philosophy behind it might have been to create economic freedom for individuals that were unbanked and who didn't have alternative banking sources. But if we look at it now today, more traditional banks and financial institutions are integrated right now with some of these products. So it's not as independent anymore. So it's a bit kind of interesting on that.
Jacqui, thank you so much for that, because that and these slides get me to 3 topics that I know we're going to want to explore deeper in the next edition. The first is this decentralized versus centralized, because there's an administrative piece of that that's causing a lot of consideration. The second is this really popular question of proof of stake versus proof of work, and the impact that the proof of work has on power consumption and other energy consumption, environmental factors, and the shift to proof of stake. When you have organizations like Ethereum that are forked, and now they've come up with different models, one for each, for example. And then I think the last piece of it is, as you're stating, initial coin offerings are different ways to monetize and create currency and valuations. Those are some of the key elements that as we dig deeper in those, they may open doors for consideration by our audience and potentially creating value. But what I found interesting and exciting was the efficiencies that are being used today in the use cases we did in this version of research. And so this gets into kind of like, why does this whole thing matter? Well, let me briefly share from my perspective. Our startup, our social impact startup is IP Rights for All. We look at blockchain as a way to help protect and monetize intellectual property rights for underrepresented communities and making it cost effective, as Jacqui mentioned, and also putting it into a format that can actually be exchanged for value with things like smart contracts. So we're seeing interest like that come into populations that have their unbanked communities, as was mentioned, but also in repatriating currency and sending money back home, for example. We're seeing platforms and innovation. So when we think of it practically, we look at the transparency of it, speed, cost savings, and the fact that it creates new business models like programmable tokens. What about your viewpoint, on that, Jacqui?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was having a conversation, I guess it was 2 days ago, with someone over in the Netherlands about a platform that they created for programmable money, which is similar to what you just said about the tokens, but it was from the idea of rewarding and supporting people with changing their behavior. So, again, when you look at the history of money, it's, it started with a barter system, and then, it ended up having the banks. So within the example that was shared, which I already knew about the project, but he was talking about how in Africa, the UN actually is using his platform to create these cards that would allow money from the UN to be given to women who are entrepreneurs who are reselling fruit, but who also need to purchase the spots that they have to sit to do the resale of the fruit in. And when they don't, in the morning, they don't have the money. By the afternoon, hopefully they do. But if they get kicked out of the spot in the morning, then they don't have the money to also to buy food for their families. So it ends up being an economic situation within the country. And so the collectors of the space fees also are paying taxes, which helps the overall country. So basically what the UN is doing through this programmable money, and again, it's all token and blockchain based, is that they are giving the cards with the allocated amount to the women. The women can then pay the individuals to rent the space. And the money comes directly from the UN. So they don't have bank. That's the other thing. So these women don't have bank accounts. So they have no other way to do an electronic transaction. So, it's the technology is showing that the money is being used for the proper use. It's not being used for something other than for the rental of the space. And so that it's trackable, traceable, and it's, using the technology to promote good. So again, you have currency, you have the altcoins, you have Bitcoin, and then you have the use of technology, which ends up being a currency in itself, but in a different way.
I mean, that's amazing and powerful. And it gets to that last point on this slide about new business models.
Yeah.
And the potential for democratization strikes me as comparable to a Grameen Bank and to microfinancing that Muhammad Yunus concept came up with in environments where traditional banking is just not practical. And I see Kashfia is raising a hand, so jump on in, Kashfia.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for sharing. And I know it's just the two of us, me and Terry, but thanks for presenting anyways. Appreciate it. I just had a quick question on your last slide that you said this is mainly for unbanked communities. So when you say that, what does that mean? Like, are they unbanked because they don't have access to banks, or is it because they choose not to be part of banks because of lack of documentation? Or, I mean, What exactly do you mean when you say unbanked communities? Is it a choice, or is it because they don't have access to banks for whatever reasons and they don't meet the criteria? Thanks.
I was the one, I think, I don't know that it was Chris. I was the one that used the word unbanked. When I was describing, Chris, did you use the word unbanked too, as well?
I didn't. I drew the analogy to Muhammad Yunus and to microfinance, but just to go directly to Kashi's point, it is actually not primarily for unbanked. It just has a
Correct.
great application for the unbanked.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and again, the technology can be used by anyone, but part of the philosophy when when some of the entrepreneurs that are using blockchain technology, they realize that it would support individuals that didn't have access to banks because they could use it on their phone, or they could transmit from one wallet to another without having an intermediary. So, but like every other monetary system, there's many layers, and it can be complicated and simple. But the use of cryptocurrency, like Bitcoin, has been used in human rights situations where people had to flee the country and didn't have the papers or access to their accounts. And so others were able to send them funds. Now, granted, you still have to have a shop or a place that will accept the cryptocurrency. So it's not going to be used it's not valid if you can't use it. Otherwise, it's just something on your phone. So you'd have to have an end result. And that's one of it's one of the developments that have happened over the last 10 years, with El Salvador creating a huge ecosystem that is using Bitcoin, and other communities as well. It showed that vendors could use this for an exchange of products or services. But again, if you, like anything else, if you don't accept something, like I might have a cup and I want to exchange it for your cup, but if you don't want to exchange it for me, then I still have a cup. And so, again, with fiat, if you think about the globe, when I travel from the United States over to Europe, I have to exchange my fiat to euros. Then they might accept dollars, but if someone doesn't, then I still have to do an exchange. Otherwise, I can't get the product or service. So that's no different than cryptocurrency. So it's a question of how do you expand the ecosystem to accept the cryptocurrency? And that's part of the challenge with some of the alt tokens, is that I might have Polygon, or I might have Solana, or I might have some of these other alt tokens, but I can maybe only spend it, quote unquote, in their ecosystem. It maybe not be applied in other communities yet. So that's a challenge, unless you can cross over and exchange it and have it be multiple purposed. Then so that's why with MasterCard, with Visa, with PayPal, with all these other entities somehow getting into the game of using cryptocurrency on their platform, even like I think it was Square now can accept Bitcoin if you open up a wallet with them. Again, it's the idea that there's now multiple ways that you can maybe do a cross exchange, again with fees, because there's always transaction fees. So again, it's part of the business world.
And if I may build on that, Kashi, and then we'll transition, because I think several of these use cases go directly to the point, to the heart of your point. In later shows, we'll get into, for example, interoperability, which is something that which Jacqui is referring of. If you have a different coin or different currency, under certain constraints right now, you can't really exchange value directly between them. So that's a standard that many parties are working out. And how do you do that on a crypto basis with the traditional or fiat currency? So we'll get into some of those, but these use cases, especially one on China, which comes a little later, we'll go directly to some of your point. The key current versions of use cases are primarily in supply chains. And we're talking about big use cases, so where there's significant adoption. And you can see it talks about going from the factory to the distributor, if there is one, to the retailer. It creates a record of evidence that's cryptographically protected with mathematics. And you may say, well, why does that matter? Well, you get more efficiencies, you get more speed, you get potentially more trust. And it shows up in some of these significant market opportunities. And Jacqui, stop me or jump in at your discretion, but we looked at a use case for Walmart and IBM that is still operational as far as the chain of custody for food, which lets Walmart, which has broad supply chain globally, be able to track the authenticity and the stops of various food components going into its system. It has shipping, for example, the Maersk trade lens project. It actually shut down in 2022 because it didn't meet their numbers, but in launching that project, and Maersk is a major shipping line, they were able to get over 50% of the world's traffic to participate in it before they closed it down. And again, they did this with IBM. And then last but not least, one that this retailer is still trumpeting is De Beers and diamonds. And many of us are familiar with blood diamonds and other questions and issues about the custody of these gems. Well, De Beers has come up with a tracer system that helps them to trace the provenance of their diamonds. And so that helps to preserve the value for them. Your perspective on that, Jacqui?
Yeah, the supply chain use is finding more and more applications because also of climate change and the sustainability issues within the UN, to try to trace, how clean a supply chain is from the ecosystem for, whether it's organic food or whether it's, just climate credits. So there are a lot of things that people are building and using the technology, because within the coding, or what they call smart contracts, they can specify that if a certain thing does happen, then this will go do this. And so again, it's accountability, and which many companies and communities, one, don't want, but two, the other challenge with this is the cost factor, because in the EU, they're passing many laws, which again, I'm happy to have laws passed, but they're making it very costly for companies because of the intent to try to have clarity, both with digital assets as well as the climate area. They're requiring companies to say that in the entire ecosystem chain, that everyone has to follow the same rules. So even if you're not physically based in the EU, they're saying that if you start down in South America and you end up having a product coming into the EU, that you have to have the same fidelity. Well, that it can be challenging when you are maybe don't have the costs for some of the things that need to happen. So we're seeing that there's a lot of good that can happen with the technology, but then because of the transparency, it's also showing some of the weaknesses within not the technology, but within our compliance system.
Yeah. Well, in fact, let me just point out one thing on this slide, and then I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit to keep us on target. To crystallize what Jacqui said, look at the IBM use case. It took the time for tracking provenance from 7 days to 2.2 seconds. Think about that for a second. If you're buying that organic product, which costs you maybe 2 or 3 times more, you're like, is this really organic? Or are they just calling it that and charging more money? The ability for them to actually answer that question for you has shifted. And so it's tremendous time savings, as well as a potential trust enhancement. And we're seeing similar use cases from a payment and settlement perspective. And this comes about quite a bit in global trade. Near instant payment delivery, like the IBM use case we saw before, supplier cash flow, where you can get paid sooner because you can prove that you delivered sooner. And then stable coins and other tokenized assets, like in the case of the entrepreneurs, the female entrepreneurs that Jacqui mentioned, or those who may be using mobile phones to create new communities for offering services. And that leads to some of these use cases that you can see here. So let me pause for a second and see if Jacqui has any comments that she'd like to jump in.
No, I agree with you. And, given time, this is definitely something that we can expand on in December, because this is going to be a series that we're continuing into 2026, where we're going to be both looking at an overview as well as maybe diving deeper into the technical side, as well as the application side. Again, the payment and settlement systems, the underlying interface, it's interesting because also of who controls the financial markets. And so, again, we as consumers don't think about the big players who are making the decisions for us. We just try to use the tools and think, okay, how does this apply to us, in our local community? But really, the challenge with some of the interfaces, if they don't buy into it because they don't see that they're going to make money from it, they're going to put up, like a lot of lobbying groups, barriers to technology change. So the reason why I think we're seeing a lot of the transition right now in favor of blockchain is because they're figuring out how do they make money from it. It wasn't until they decided that they could make money from it did we start to see others kind of come on board. And so that's a good thing, but it's also maybe not a good thing, because the philosophy behind why they're doing it is more profit motivated, not so much individual motivated. However, in the long run, I think that the technology will probably benefit everyone. So even if and also we know that when you have something, and we can see it from the introduction of drugs and pharmaceuticals, the more that a drug is mass produced, the cheaper it becomes. So if we can have the underlying technology be adopted by the major players, then it will become less expensive for the smaller companies to adopt. The challenge with this is that, like a lot of other professions, we're not training people in the United States. Well, we are, but we're not training enough of them to understand the technology development. So as a result, we might have to rely on outside sources for hiring people to develop this tech. So that's also another challenge.
Well, thanks for that. And push forward aggressively now, but I want to highlight on this slide, these are global payment systems. For example, India's system dealing with $2.8 trillion US. These are global payment systems that are not currently on blockchain, but each one of them is pursuing blockchain development and integration. And that kind of gets us to some other examples of what Jacqui's mentioned also, as far as being able to trust. In the pharmaceutical space, there are organizations using blockchain now to help verify the chain of custody for drugs and whether or not they in fact are efficacious and legitimate, because there is that opportunity for fake drugs, which could be tremendously detrimental to public safety. And that kind of gets us to the cross-border payment elements that are listed here, which are significantly of interest to Global Chamber members. And one of the best use cases there is a European system that's being developed with Target. And as you can see, it deals with significant, roughly about $3 trillion, significant amounts of volume every day. And the reason for their pursuing these kind of things is to reduce cost, enhance trust. And as Jacqui so astutely identified, to maximize profits wherever they can in most cases. And whereas some of the social impact space, we're looking to instead reduce cost and then to diversify the value so that it goes to a broader section of folks on that. So now let's kind of bring it home from a tokenization of assets perspective, because this is one of the most unique things I'll mention very briefly. DC Startup Week, gentleman talks about tokenizing cattle. So real world assets being represented digitally by a token, and which enables them to trade on a more efficient way. Think about things like that. I mean, these are unique and amazing developments. And then there's some that are a little bit more challenging. As you see, US securities here, they're securitizing assets and they're tokenized again. efficiency, lower costs, reduce friction, the ability to track and to trust. And that kind of gets us to the use case that Cashvia, you mentioned, I wanted to really highlight for you. Unfortunately, it relates to kind of a surveillance economy. Whereas China has its real DID system, which is based on blockchain. And this is a system that could observe you jaywalking on the street and penalize you for it in almost, not quite, almost real time. So there are some significant applications here that have big implications for people. So if you would give some thought to whether these use cases are of interest to you and how they might be deployed. And we'll look for you to give us some feedback in our next show. And that'll help us decide how we want to dig deeper. So now before we wrap things up for this show, does anyone have any other questions or comments? And Kashmir, thank you for your question. Or Thierry and others, you want to put on the table for us before we close it?
That makes sense.
If no one goes, can I ask you something else?
Absolutely. And while you're doing that, Kashmir, we have our key takeaways just to summarize this, but go for it.
So I understand it's very cost effective and it's very easy and it'll cut the cost to a fraction. There's transparency. I get all that and all the pros, and it's amazing. Though I'm not very good with this. I don't really understand blockchain and crypto very well. I find it very complicated. And I'm an auditor by profession, so I have no idea how I'm going to audit if these things come up, but I'm sure I have to hire people. But, and I don't know if this is something that's, whether you or Jacqui can address, but since one of the positives is for it to be anonymous or pseudonymous. And also there's a lot of peer-to-peer with the intermediaries gone, which is why the costs are low. Then how does how do you monitor and how do AML laws apply here, like anti-money laundering, or like if it's illegal or not, how would you measure compliance in these transactions? And also, if there are no intermediaries, say you and I have a transaction and something happens and I never get my money, who's going to help me get my money from you? I don't know. Just a thought. Thanks, Chris.
I'm gonna hold the bulk response to that till the next show. That is such a powerful question. My brief response would be that goes back to some of the debate between decentralized versus centralized. And I will also say that Jacqui knows more about this from a policy perspective than I've forgotten. So I'm going to ask her for a quick response to tide us over till the next show.
Yeah, the caveat is quick. So I'll go to the question that you asked. If you do a transaction with someone and you don't get, the results, that's no different than a contract. If you, meet someone in real life and that type of thing, the challenge is, do you know who the person is that you're transacting with? And then the question is, how do you collect? So again, we can go into all that in December. And there might be answers, there might not be answers. And also in terms of the AML and the KYC, that will depend upon your industry. And we can talk about that because that is also a longer than just a 1-minute answer, but very valid questions. And the last thing I'll say is that many in our industry are figuring out how to answer those questions. There are some answers, but there are also some more questions that are also always being raised because the technology is changing. So.
For the question, Kashmir, and Jacqui, thanks you for jumping in on the response. So here are the takeaways, and Kashmir basically summarized it. And yes, there are major issues and policy matters to be addressed. We want to invite you to come back to the next show, though. Please do. Tell someone.
I will come back with more questions.
Outstanding. If you have, and during the interim, if you have questions, join the WhatsApp group for either FinTech or for What's Up in Global Law. And we really appreciate your engagement today. This gave us an opportunity to test our theories and look forward to building on that for the next show. Any closing words, Jacqui?
What I would suggest to everyone is visit the Blockchain Legal Institute. It's a centralized library of decentralized resources, and there's a ton of information from videos to links and things like that. And it's a living library. So as the questions are getting asked, we are trying to answer them in the library. And again, come back every month at the third Friday at 4 p.m. because we are here to educate and also to support your business development.
And for those who want it, we'll send you a copy of this because, as folks who are both knowledgeable of both AI and blockchain, we put validation links in. So you can go and, just because you don't totally trust the AI yet, and that's wise, you can go and look for yourself. Take care, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
You too. Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Chris. Bye.
Thank you. Take care now.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Doug. Take care.
Let's see who the host is. Okay.